Okay. So we finished off the last stream talking about just an overview of everything we're going to talk about over the next 2 weeks between lessons 9 and lesson 10. The next two pieces that we're going to focus on is how to use SharedPreferences. And then in lesson 10, we'll talk about how to use SQLite and more specifically to use SQLite with Room. So those are the two big things that we're going to cover over the next 2 weeks. After that, I'd like to hit Firebase because it's, again, there's a lot of developers using that now. It seems to be pretty solid. So what we're going to get started with here is talking about shared preferences. Okay. So I want to talk about what it is. How do we read and write to it, as well as how do we listen for changes to the shared preferences, especially since you normally have, say, a settings screen where you change it, and then other screens, other activities, when you come back, will need to reflect those changes. So sometimes you need to listen for those changes. Also, for some of the things on the settings screen, you usually need to listen for changes there to be able to update what they call the summary of that setting or other kind of things to show toasts and such when you change settings. All right. So what is shared preferences? Shared preferences allows you to read and write small amounts of primitive data as key value pairs to a file that's on device storage. Now, typically that will be on internal storage, and that's usually what you want, okay? So we'll use the shared preference class for these APIs. A little bit of terminology. In Android, there's something called a preference, and there's something called a shared preference. And the names that they've given them are a little bit counterintuitive. So a preference is the setting that you actually see in the settings screen. It's the UI. The preference is actually the UI, whereas the shared preference is actually the way we store the data. So preferences are the UI to represent the settings screen, and a shared preference is how we save the data as key valued pairs. So the names are, if you were to ask me what I would call those, I would call those preferences and then like preference data storage. So you can think of shared preference more as preference data storage is maybe the better way to think about it. So one of the things that you might think is, well, we've already looked at one way to store data. And we looked at storing data with something called SavedInstanceState. And if you remember right, that used a bundle, and we saved it when you say you saved it before there was a configuration change, and then you restored it after the configuration change. So if you turn your screen from landscape to portrait or vice versa, you're going to call on SavedInstanceState to save that state. And then in either on create or on restore instance state, you're going to then restore that state information. So that's what we did with SavedInstanceState. Okay, both shared preference and SavedInstanceState kind of work similar in the sense that they both store small amounts of key value pairs. And that data is both of those cases, the data is private to the application. So SavedInstanceState, shared in preference, both of these, you can't share it with another app and you don't want to, because they're specifically designed for those kind of things. So with the SavedInstanceState, it does restore it. You can save it and restore it when you do a orientation change. But remember, with our SavedInstanceState, if we leave the app and come back, all of our data is lost. So the SavedInstanceState is only within a single, what we would call session. If you leave the app, it's gone. Or if you close the screen, you go back in the backstack, you leave the screen, you've lost that instance state. So it's only as long as you're on that screen, on that activity. So shared preferences, in opposition to that, is persisted across user sessions. Even if you shut down the app and restart it, you'll still have those shared preferences saved. So it gives us a way to store that data for a little bit longer. But it's still only a way to store small amounts of data, right? So this is good for small amounts of data. If we want more data storage, that's where we're going to jump over to SQLite and store it in a database. So, for instance, things like things you might do with a parsable, those are kind of okay as long as you keep it small in if you're saving them in SavedInstanceState, but I wouldn't want to save those same things in shared preferences. So again, if I'm getting, say, the top 20 stories from NPR, that might be something that's okay to pass around in SavedInstanceState because it's not going to be there for very long. But I don't want to save that to shared preferences because it's going to be bigger than I want it to be. So it'd be better to save that kind of thing to a cache file rather than saving it to your shared preferences. So the data that's in shared preferences is going to be, again, remembered across sessions. That's the big difference. Most common use for shared preferences is to store kind of user preferences or settings, specifically things that would be on a settings screen. So one of those common cases would be like for notifications, how frequently do you ping the server? Because the more frequently you ping it, the more bandwidth as well as the more battery life that you're going to use. So some users that have like unlimited data and they have a good battery life, they might want to ping the server every 15 minutes. That might be good for them. They want to know right away. Whereas your other users, which are not have good data, have lower data caps, or have other things that are causing their battery to run low, whether it be just an old phone or old battery, they might want to say, well, I only want to check once a day. So having a settings screen and storing that in shared preferences allows them to then do things like that. It also allows them potentially to turn notifications off and on. This actually used to be how we did that before we had channels. Before we had notification channels, we'd put those settings into the settings screen and have them turn the notifications off and on there. So that's also something you can do. You can still do that for older devices that don't have notification channels. As far as working with shared preferences, every app should really only have one shared preferences file. There's no reason to have more than one. So that's kind of the expectation. The general name, usually that name of the app of the settings file, you're going to use your package name. Okay, so if my app is edu.rankin.prsmith.helloworld, well, that's going to be the name of my file. And that makes it fairly easy to come up with a name and have it be unique, is to just use that package name. So that's the expectation typically with your settings file, your shared preference file, is it should just be the package name. There's another parameter when we create the shared preferences file. We need to specify the mode. The mode you're always going to set to mode private. It's a compatibility thing. Again, there used to be other modes. There are other modes that are kind of constants in the system. But nowadays, that's the only one we use for security purposes because we don't want that preference file to be leaked to any other apps. So there's just better tools to use if we want to share data with another app. So the general way of setting that up, getting connected with shared preferences, there's a few things you'll want to do. First, you'll want to create a constant up top on the top of your activity to say hit or application class or wherever. You'll want to say, here's the name of my here's the name of my package. Here's the name of the file. So the file is going to be com example android hello shared preferences. So that's the name of my file. I'm also going to create a member variable to store the shared preferences object. and then in onCreate, I'm going to then get the shared preferences. So this is going to create the file if it doesn't exist, or get the data that's in there so I can read it. Now, one thing to note, at the time that we called get shared preferences, that's when it actually loads the data from the file. Okay, that's when it's actually going and reading the file, when I call get shared preferences. So if I look at it again, if I look at the preferences object later, I'll still see the same values potentially from when it was loaded initially there. But typically we'll put this get shared preferences call in the onCreate method. Okay. When we want to save settings or edit settings, we're going to use the SharedPreferences.editor object. And that editor object takes care of any of the file I/O operations. It takes care of making sure, if the file needs to be created, it gets created. If there's a directory that needs to get created, that directory gets created, all those kind of things. So it takes care of all the file I/O operations. So we basically just put values in and read values out. It means that we don't have to deal with all of the low level file I/O bits. So in order to write values, we use the various put methods like put int, put string, etc., put boolean. And if that key is already there, it will override it. If it's a new key, it'll go ahead and create that new key. Once we've done all the puts, we need to call apply. Apply will then go save those changes and put them actually push them to the file. Apply does it asynchronously. There is another method called commit, which does it synchronously, which means if you call commit, it'll wait for the file to be written before it returns, whereas apply will say, okay, I've got it, I'll do it when I have time, and it will do it later, but not block what you're doing. With things being what it is, you always want to call apply at this point and not commit. For the most part, you're going to want to say apply, because then it will make sure it gets saved, versus commit. Things can happen and it might actually fail because your thing gets aborted because of an ANR or whatever else may happen. So if you call commit, you're more likely to end up with a file that actually is half written than with apply, which is kind of maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but it is what it is. So typically, most often, and this isn't the only way to do it, a lot of times we'll save these preferences in the onPause method. That's not always the case. In a lot of cases it is, where we're going to say let's save the preferences in onPause, and that means that there's no commit button or submit button that the user has to press. But sometimes we do want a submit button, or an OK button, right? So if there is some sort of submit or OK button, then that's where we would do this saving. We would do the saving in response to that button click. Okay, so either way, whether we're doing it in response to onPause or if we're doing it in response to a button click, we would say, well, let's get the editor object. Let's say editor.putInt, so we give it the name and the value. So here I've got a member variable where I'm storing the current count. So I'm going to write that out as an integer, or I'm going to write the color. I'm also going to write the color out as an integer, and then I have to remember to hit apply. So both of these things are kind of queued up, and then they're actually saved to the file when we hit apply. And that way you only have one write operation instead of two write operations, which again, the big benefit there is the fewer write operations you have, it's less work for the system to do, but it also means that there's less errors that you will encounter. So I wouldn't want to break these up as two applies. It'd be much more likely for something to go wrong, because they might step on each other. So I'm going to do that as many puts as I can and then hit apply. One thing here too, when you're doing this and on pause, the system nowadays does go ahead and take care of making sure that file actually gets written. So even if your app goes away, shuts down, the user's leaving the app, that apply will go ahead and get a chance to finish writing out the preferences. So to restore preferences, we use the get methods. So we use the put methods to write, and we use the get methods to read. When we use those get methods, we want to use the versions that take 2 parameters. So the first parameter is the key, and the second one is the default value. So the default value is what it's going to use if either there's no preference file at all, you've never saved it, like it's the first run of the application, or the setting isn't there for whatever reason. So you always want to supply a default value for it to fall back to. And the upside of doing that is then we don't have to do tests after we have retweeted it to say, well, if we didn't get a value, or if it was 0, or if it was empty string, or blah 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 blah, if we didn't get a value, then do this logic, which would result in a lot of if statements, or potentially a lot of try catch statements. So using that default value keeps our code very, very clean and very simple. It also makes it very obvious as to what the intended defaults are. Okay, so if I'm going to use that, typically where we'll restore those shared preferences is going to be in the onCreate method. Okay, so in the onCreate method, I might have some code like this. I'm going to say, okay, let's get the shared preferences object. So I've got the name of my file, I've got mode private, and then I'm going to say, okay, if there is no saved instance state, right? This is kind of the first time we've gotten to the screen. Well, then we're going to try and restore the settings from the shared preference object. Whereas if this is from a screen rotation, I'm going to try and instead restore it from saved instance state. So my else down here would be doing it would be restoring it from the saved instance state, versus this one is restoring it from the shared preferences. And yeah, you could take this exact same code and move it to on restore, and that would work just as well. So this code here could either be an on restore instance state, or it could be an on create. It's really depends on the situation. Okay, so in order to restore the state, so this is where I'm starting to read the values. So I'm saying mpreferences.getInt. Okay, so remember I said put int to save the values. I'm going to say getInt to read the values. I'm going to pass in the key, which is count, and the default value, which is 1. Now notice if I go back and look at the save, right? So when I saved it, I used this key count and I used this key color. I need to use those same keys when I'm restoring the values. So it's count here and color there. It will also be count here and color there. So we need to make sure we use that same key. Same way you work with saved instance state. You save it with one key and you restore it with the same key. So we're going to say grab the count. If there's no count, then we're going to default it to 1. Grab the color. If there's no color, then we're going to use our default background color constant that we defined in, say, colors XML. There's also another one here where we're restoring this new text string. So we're saying mpreferences get string. We're getting the text as the key. And if there's no value stored, then we're going to restore it as empty string. Depending on your setup, you might want the default to be null. You might want the default to be empty string. Other cases, you may want to have a default value there that's neither of those two things. So if the default... let's say by default something should be everybody, you could say everybody there, or all ingredients, or whatever it may be. If you have a default value, that's what you would use. And then once I've got those values up, I just need to update the UI. So I'm going to say, okay, now that I've got my count and I've got my current color, I'm going to say, okay, I've got my mShowCount text to you. I'm going to say set text. We're going to set it to that mCount using a little format string to turn it from an integer to a string, and then I'm going to say set background color. So that'll change the text and the background color of this mShowCount control. So that's the thing to know. You load the values first, and then you update the UI using those values. Now, if we do want to reset all of the user settings, because maybe they want to go back to what it was when they started using the app for whatever reason, we can call clear on the editor. Clear will throw away all the settings that are already there and then put in just the ones that we have. So we can combine put and clear together before we call apply, but regardless of what order we put those puts and clears in, the clear will always happen first. So if we do put clear, it will do the clear first and then the puts. If we do clear and then put, it will still do the clear before the puts. So it's going to delete everything that's in there, absolutely every setting that's in there. They'll all go back to default values. And then we just put in the values we want. So for instance, if we wanted to reset the user settings, it would typically look like this. We'd say create an editor, mPreferences.edit, clear all the settings, and then apply. So this would mean if we run this code, we maybe put this in some sort of either a menu item, or we put it in response to some sort of reset button. That will then put them back to all the default settings as soon as they click that reset button. So we can also listen for changes. And again, the big place where this comes in is if you're, say, changing the settings on another screen, and then you want to see those changes on say on the settings screen, and you want to see them on another screen that's maybe earlier in your call stack, you may need to listen for those changes. This also might happen if you're, say, having a service or like a job service, and you're trying to change that interval. Well, the application is then going to have to listen for changes to shared preferences to know that it needs to reschedule the job with that new interval. So oftentimes that may be if you're putting the code like we did in Fortune Cookie in your application object, your application object is probably going to implement this listener. So this listener this interface only has one method. It's on shared preference changed. That's the callback that you have to implement. And then we register it with mPreferences. We register with the register on shared preference changed listener. So it's usually going to look like that. We'd have to retrieve the preference object, the shared preference object previously, and then we're going to use this. So we need to register and unregister it in whatever lifecycle methods are appropriate. So if this is in the application, I would register it in onCreate, and then I would just never unregister it. If I was doing this using this in an activity, I might say register it in onPause, unregister it in onResume. Register it in onResume, unregister it and on pause, or depending on my circumstance, more than likely it probably would be register it and on create and unregister it and on destroy. If you read at least this chapter, they say that the most common is on resume and on pause, but I would say probably in most cases, if you're going to register these preference change lister, you probably actually want to do it in on create and on destroy. Okay, so implementing this interface. So I've got my settings activity. We're going to say implements on shared preference change listener, and then we're going to actually implement the method. So this method takes two things. It takes the shared preferences object, which is the one that changed, and then it also takes a key telling me which setting changed. So if you're doing apply, this event actually may be fired multiple times, one for each setting that's changed. So keep that in mind. Generally in here, we want to say, okay, which key changed, because I usually don't care about all of the settings. Any listener that I'm writing here, I usually only care about some of the settings that may have changed. So I'm going to say, okay, well, if the key is this, right, I'm going to say, okay, let's go do something about it. So let's say the interval changed for notifications. I'd say, well, I have a constant here for the interval setting, and then I'd say, well, that's equal to the setting that changed. Okay, well, let's reschedule the job. Let's reschedule the job service that I'd set up for notifications if that key changed. So that's what that usually looks like. You're usually going to have a bunch of if-else statements there to check the key. And note that the order I'm doing this, and we kind of talked about this previously, I've got a constant, so I want to put that constant to the left, and then the key to the right, so I don't have to deal with null pointer exceptions potentially. As far as registering the listener, we implemented it here, but we also need to register it. So say in onCreate, I would say, okay, well, let's get the preferences object. And then once I've gotten the preferences object, I'm going to then register my listener immediately after that to see changes. Now, one thing that they mention, you need to make sure that you have a strong reference to your listener. So if you're using say an anonymous object to implement this listener, it's going to get garbage collected because the shared preferences object doesn't keep a strong reference to those. It kind of keeps a weak reference to those listeners. Now, as long as you do implement the listener as part of like activity, a service, an application, as long as you say at the top of the class implements blah 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 like this, you don't need to worry about that strong reference, shared reference part. Strong reference, weak preference part. As long as the whole class is implementing that interface, it's null and void. You won't run into that issue because your activity and such won't get garbage collected. So usually it's best to just go ahead and have the class implement that rather than having a nested class implement that listener like we might normally do. Like otherwise, I might normally declare the listener here as an anonymous object, which we've done with like button click listeners, your on interaction listeners. We've done those kind of things. But if you do that, then you're going to find out that your listener gets garbage collected and you stop receiving events. So if you're going to implement this interface, just the safest way to do it is like so, rather than using and then use this here rather than creating a little anonymous object. So that's the end of the slides here. Your practical for 9.1 is to build this Hello Shared Preference application. And it's kind of like it's very similar to one of the applications that we created at the beginning of the semester. So it's got a counter here that just counts up. And then it's got some buttons that can change the background and the color of that counter. So you hit count. Every time you hit count, the count goes up. And then if you hit these buttons, the color changes. So you're also going to add a reset button to that. So when you hit reset, it'll throw away all those shared preferences, go back to the default. But the difference with this versus what we did previously in the semester is that you're going to be able to close the app and come back to it, and those two things will be preserved, your count as well as your color. So that's what's really different about SharedPreferences versus SavedInstanceState, is that ability to leave the app and still preserve settings. That's something that we haven't had the ability up till now. I don't remember what it was early in the semester. I know somebody asked me about, well, what if the user leaves the app and comes back? How can we save that data? Is there something that we can do? Well, this is where we start getting into that. So now we can start saving data with this tool, as well as what we'll talk about with the SQLite database, the Room database. Will allow us to save data beyond when the user leaves the app. Is that something we haven't done yet? Okay. Questions? Slide 18. So that would be remember the M usually represents a instance variable, right? That lowercase m usually represents an instance variable. So you would define private shared preferences and preferences. On here, you're asking about, can I use a switch? I believe that Java still does not support switch statements with strings. I think it's only integer types still, and enums, which are basically enums, are basically integers. So this one, I'm assuming you're talking about the strong references one was missing. Or maybe it was just out of date. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's. I think I added this line late to the scene. I think I added it to that slide after I pushed it up to Perusal. So on here, and that's mainly just because it's just you usually want those lines to be right next to each other, and that wasn't really clear without that there. So for this lab, you got kind of the overview. That's what you're going to build. You're going to start with this starter project, the Hello SharedPref starter. Go through the 2 tasks, and then there's a coding challenge. I do want you to do the coding challenge, as well as I want you to do the homework. So the homework is going to have you go back to your Scorekeeper app, which we created earlier in the semester, and add in this shared preferences logic to it so that it keeps the score when you leave the app and come back. Okay. Any other questions? Other than that, I'm going to shut the stream down and go ask more questions on Discord if you need to.